Welcome to Council's Judgment, episode 4. We're going to kick it off today with some sad debriefing of the year-end top 8, then kind of continue on talking about the state of the metagame and where we think the format's at in general after one of the larger kind of most eyes on it tournaments of the year. So let's bring in two of our competitors from the top 8. Firstly, we have Spencer Kanaka slash Sacklund. How are you doing today, Mr. First Round Loser?
Hey, Kitchen Finks was a meta choice. It's not my fault.
And secondly, we have semi-finalist after a council on council kill, Sacha Christensen. How are you doing, Sacha?
I'm doing okay. We should point Demir machinations to one.
Yeah, no, let's not do that. Every terrible deck I play always has that card in it. So as I was kind of saying at the top there, do some review on the top 8, take a look at some of the more interesting matchups, decks potentially, and then also take a in-depth look or discussion of Spencer and Sacha's match and Sacha's semi-final match as well.
Getting under the hood of the matchups and our decision-making process for different pivotal turns for sure.
Totally. All right, so first thing I want to talk about with regards to top 8, we obviously had our pre-top 8 episode talking about what we expected people to be playing and what their kind of range was. I think for the most part, we were pretty good, other than I believe Robin played Blue Moon, which was a bit funky in terms of what we would have put him on. But I think everyone else was kind of in the range that we thought, hey?
Yeah, I actually had put him on a control deck as his like outlier if he didn't last minute audible to Storm. I saw him playing blue white control and he had a conversation with me where he kind of brainwormed me into thinking that control was good as well. But I did more so put him on Jeskai, but I thought that he would want to style so bad after actually hearing his little interview that we did. So I was like, he will definitely play Blue Moon, Blue Red, or Storm. So I actually wasn't surprised to see him play Blue Moon because it's one that he has a bunch of reps with.
Yeah, I also thought that I thought Jeskai was the most likely, and I thought that the chance of him playing Storm was pretty low.
Tyler, you're missing something really important, by the way, and I just want to get it out of the way just at the top of the show, and that's that Sacha dirted me, and by doing so, he played Black Lotus. And I mean, we can discuss about how he dirted me off Thalia, how he convinced me that several 8 bears were a bad choice going to this top 8. But really, the true betrayal comes to the fact that now, Tyler, I lost our bet.
Mine and your bet?
Yeah, remember we bet that I bet against there being any Lotus in the top 8.
Oh, that's right. Oh, yeah. Man, I get 2 free entry fees now. It's
Correct, sir.
fantastic. Oh, man. See, I'm glad you're a noble and a scholar because I completely forgot about that.
And just to fully own up to this, Spencer, I did not mean to. I genuinely believe you should have cut Thalia from your deck, but let the record show, I still hold that belief. And my plan going into this top 8 was basically like, okay, I have a 14% chance of running Spencer round 1. I have a 16% chance of fighting him round 2 if he has like a 50% win rate. And I like those odds. I also thought it was less likely you'd be playing Death and Taxes after your last week with it. So I felt pretty okay going with Doomsday Breach, and I felt like I had a really good matchup against the rest of the field aside from you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I had D&T sleeved and I played a practiced game, but I just drew 7 planes in a row and then I lost to mono red and that tilted me off of it. And whether or not that's actually like a good form of testing, obviously it's not. But sometimes if you're tilted off a deck, like you're just tilted off a deck and there's nothing you can do to change that feeling. And at the end of the day, there's some gut instincts. And I thought my gut was telling me that a monsters deck, Gruul or Naya, would be good. I would have, I think, play probably like 97 of the same cards. I unfortunately
Yeah.
got matched with probably for many reasons, never mind the dad on dad, council on council kill, but also what I thought was my worst round 1 match.
Yeah, it was definitely awkward where a lot of your individual card choices ended up coming up a lot.
Yeah, I was obviously rooting for you guys to be on separate ends of the bracket, as I think that would have been a much better finals than round 1 match, both selfishly and just presentation and speed of play perhaps wise. But I thought, and having actually played a pretty reasonable amount of this matchup from both sides, I do think it's, albeit very a quick matchup generally, it is a pretty interesting one to kind of weave through the hate versus removal, what lines up with what kind of thing. And card choices obviously play a huge role in that. I know, Sacha, that I tended to play a little bit more removal in my breach list than you, and that bit me a couple times, but also sometimes it just lets you line up against some of their cards better. How did you feel kind of in the matchup, and how it went? Did it kind of go how you'd expect versus the list that Spencer presented?
I definitely felt like I had some like quite strong draws into Spencer's deck in general. Game one definitely felt like a good illustration to me of what makes the monsters deck so good against like specifically like Doomsday Breach in general, and that's that it can sometimes just amount this incredible amount of pressure, and it puts you in a spot where any sort of disruption, like even if it's only a one turn delay worth of disruption, acts really close to a time lock. And so like game one is a good example of that where I had to go for this turn four kill. Ended up the only reason why I got to turn four was because I drew Collective Brutality to answer Red Broadside Bombardiers. But even then, it wasn't enough because I needed an extra turn on top of that to deal with Spencer's Endurance in hand and or onboard Kanker Bloom.
Yeah, looking at this board is basically the worst case scenario for the combo deck, as it kind of illustrates. One, I think Spencer is very good at building these type of decks and card choices in general. And I kind of have mentioned, and we mentioned in our last episode, Spencer's really good at trying to convert 4 of consistency in a 60 card deck to 1 of consistency in 100 card decks just by looking for similar effects. And yeah, just looking at this board, it's just like a nightmare sweat for like any combo deck, really.
More so with the other combo deck, the Thoracle deck, I'd actually kind of upped my amount of enchantment removal. I was playing like Dramoka's Command, Canker Bloom, another effect, and then Get Lost. So there's some incidental hate cards out of this deck. I was definitely missing. I usually play a more of a Zooey low to the ground approach, but I thought that was going to get trounced by Mardu. So I was also missing my usual play a Magus, a Miser's Magus, and a Thalia, and an Ava Mind Sensor. So missing those 3 cards. I remember pretty much you have to have an aggressive hand, which actually valued more than having an endurance. Obviously, endurance is quite good, but endurance is really soft to some of the other hate cards, and I find that often the turn that they're going off, particularly if it's through a Doomsday kill. And correct me if I'm wrong, Sasha, but based on a lot of our games as well, like the endurance is actually not really a safe bet. It actually more is protection against an early breach than an actual Doomsday kill. So I'm actually trying to value a clock more than a hate bear.
Yeah, like to go off with Doomsday through a endurance, it requires you to have an extra mana, basically. So you need to have 2 mana floating after you've drawn your first card with Doomsday. And that lets you assemble a stack that includes Pact of Negation for the endurance. And if they play it pre you drawing into the Pact, your Jace activation will just mill the cards that get shuffled with endurance. So you're totally right, Spencer.
No, this game I felt like I did kind of have quite a good 7. You know, I had a Accelerant, 2 lands, Bone Crusher Giant, Pending, and Broadside Bombardiers. I drew into the Canker Bloom later on and the additional lands. Pending in this matchup, I didn't think is like one of the few white removal spells I don't think's dead, and I actually believe it was relevant here. I think I exiled a some sort of artifact cantrip filter, but I thought this hand was quite fast, and then I had the endurance backup in case you had a quick breach, and I felt that I could beat a Doomsday setup on this.
Yeah, the pending actually did come up where it tagged, I believe, a chromatic star when I was tapped out, which on this board state you can see would have allowed me to combo through the Canker Bloom in play and the Endurance in hand. So the pending definitely came up big here.
Very nice. Moving on to game 2, just on Spencer's side of the board, one of the things that cards I've been really impressed with testing games, or honestly for me it's been in standard, but is Inti is just such a powerful card in kind of a lot of different decks, and I've been really drawn to that card, so I'm happy to see Spencer playing it. Walk us through this game from your perspective. Did you think there's anything you could have done differently in this game, or?
I mulliganed my initial hand, which potentially maybe was more capable than this one. I didn't feel like going to 5 on the draw. I wanted either acceleration or a Ragavan or endurance in hand, plus a clock or a Mox opening. This one had a Mox opening with a Ragavan. I had a decision between dashing or not dashing. Still not quite sure what would have been correct. I think I just value having the clock of the Ragavan still more. So I think I still would have gone with that decision, even with perfect knowledge. The removal spell ended up kind of, I think, deciding this game here. With me not being able to keck with the Ragavan didn't allow me to like have more of an explosive hand and develop the scavenging ooze. And the NT is fast, and the NT never really dug me for anything that I needed. So I was also stuck in an awkward position with the endurance plus only other green card being scavenging ooze, and I really kept wanting to develop the scavenging ooze, but I believe it was turn 3 or 4 when I could have, and I just got trapped by the endurance lock of being afraid of a breach opening, and I should have just maybe developed the skews. As it turns out, I don't think it would have mattered. And NT kept bomb missing with like every removal spell. So that was that.
It's also interesting, like obviously, even if you do try to develop scavenging ooze here with only 1 green mana, like it's not going to be that much of a clock one way or the other. I guess you can kind of put a bit more pressure on the graveyard and on Sacha to have specific answers, but it is like you've basically drawn 2 mountains in a deck that probably has 2 mountains, I would assume.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean that's not super ideal in terms of mana development. Still managing an okay hand into, but it does kind of, without the early pressure of Ragavan, it allows Sacha to kind of hand sculpt and just develop a fairly easy kill, I would assume.
Sasha, also you did, I can't remember if you tutored in this game or early on you've either found the Lotus or one piece that made me believe that you had a breach that you're going to be going for. So I held this endurance up and couldn't develop my scoos because I didn't have a second green source. And then you ended up just taking like dirtling with the One Ring. And it seems like you kind of drew a bit of air, but you had most of the combo. Um, but because I was trying to play defensively, which is something that like the aggressive deck in this situation should almost never be doing, unless you have a very specific hand knowledge. Yeah, I think that actually also like really led to it. I think this is my game to like this was like your game to win at any given time, but I did have a couple opportunities. Maybe I could have applied more pressure.
Yeah, like when I had my opener, it had a removal spell, a bunch of lands, the Tolaria West to get Doomsday or to get Black Lotus and the One Ring. And because I was on the play, I felt pretty confident that I'd be able to like deal with whatever initial threats you had, potentially even ignoring them and saving the bolt for important hate bear. And then like tutoring for Black Lotus on turn 3 with Tolaria West, playing One Ring on turn 4, drawing 3 cards, and then basically being untapped on turn 5 with +3 cards from Ring, a Black Lotus in my hand. And it's difficult to lose from that situation. And even, I mean, your hand was very, very potent, both against Doomsday, but then also Breach. I think this kind of illustrates one of the strengths of Doomsday Breach is like you can sculpt a hand and you can sculpt a game plan that avoids some of that hate. And in the case of Doomsday, you can just say, oh, that hate card that's going to remove my Jace in response to the activation, I will just build a pile that responds appropriately to that.
100%. I also believe this is the game. Yeah, you had an end of turn dress down, which is always the card that I actually fear most in the matchup because it, unless you're going for a Doomsday pile and I have Fateful Absence or Get Lost or a Planeswalker removal, it kind of nullifies all my hate cards. It was probably correct regardless to endurance in response to that. But me and you play this matchup quite a few times, and I played this against Robin so many times that I believe I can't remember you either had tutored or had access to the brain freeze, and I knew you already had the Lotus. So it's like you're like making you go through the motions was pretty fairly pointless. But I think they actually mentioned that on the commentary that like we were just kind of like talking through our match, which I think we actually did. We're like, oh yeah, you're probably like 97, 90%, but like we're like, oh, let's just play these games fast. These are, you know, good interactive matches. Then watching how the rest of the top 8 went, I wish we just played it out.
Yeah.
I was like, oh,
reasonable.
in the interest of time, this 99.1% chance thing, we're just gonna go to the next game.
Listen, we were trying to set a good example.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, and so now just kind of wrap up on this match, but if you guys just want to give commentary on game 3, probably the most interesting game. I don't know how you guys felt. I did watch this match and didn't, if I didn't know who had already won, I would have thought it was like fairly not locked up one way or the other too early. So
Notably, I think Spencer, you mulled to 5 in this game?
Yes, I mulled a 5. Being on the play, I was pretty diligent that I needed acceleration into something that was either hate or hasty. So my opening 7 was, I thought, too slow and didn't have a tutor. My 6 was just borderline, and I just knew that this deck can produce better 5s. And so I just mulled again. And yeah, then I found this hand that I think had 2 lands, a bird, a Migloz, and a Thalia. So it was kind of what I was looking for out of a hand.
Yeah, and so this is where you're gonna hate the greed, Spencer. I kept a one-lander this game.
Makes sense.
So it did have Gemstone Mine and the Preordained to try and find that second land. It also notably had Dark Ritual, Perplex, and I believe I had a 0 mana draw effect in my hand. So I knew that once I got to 3 mana, I'd be able to cast the Perplex for Doomsday and then go off on a subsequent turn pretty safely. I did, and the reason why I chose this slide for this game is the turn after you resolve the Thalia, I'm really under the gun. I put an Under City Sewer into play to Surveil, and I'm just looking for any removal spell in the deck to deal with the Thalia, so I can play the Otawara untapped on my next turn to cast the Perplex, or a basic. And sure enough, knock the top of the deck, and there's a basic Swamp, and that basically locks up this game.
Yeah, it's interesting that that basic Swamp, I think, actually did win you the game. Because if it's a non-basic land, I think it delays you 1 turn, which is exactly the amount that would have ended up with you dying.
100%. It's why it was removal spell or that at that point.
Which also I think goes to show, like, I do often find the Storm matchups to be quite interesting when they don't like turn 1 you or turn 2 you. And every turn, like, a lot of things matter. Like here, like I was definitely mattering that I had a Grove of the Burnwillows. It mattered which creature I played first. It mattered, like, mulligan decisions mattered, like your cantrip decisions matter. Like, similar to when you play like a red deck wins versus a fair deck as well. Like the first 4 turns, every single decision tree has like such high impact, and it can feel like very like decision tree interesting.
Yeah, and something that I've definitely noticed playing Doomsday Breach is like you need to be thinking really far in advance. Like usually with decks, you can kind of be on autopilot. You're like gently cruising along and respond to how the game's shaping. With this deck, you kind of need to like your fetch decision turn 1 can matter an enormous amount on like the outcome of the game. And like the way you're thinking about sculpting your hand in either direction for the combo matters a lot. And this was definitely one of those games where I was thinking like, okay, this will almost, or if I can find lands in a reasonable time frame with this like on the draw plus the preordain, I'm locked for like a turn 4 kill, and that should be good enough into a mull to 5.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's Spencer will always, in a good way, I think it's a good habit, like a mulligan aggressively for hands or mulligan away hands that are like playable magic hands, but put you at a huge disadvantage to win in certain matchups. And I know Spencer had that discussion a lot about how players in general, and I've definitely been guilty of this in the past, where it's like, oh man, like point combo X, like I keep losing to it on like turn 3 or something. And it's like, well, did you keep a hand that had like Flame Slash and a couple creatures and another removal spell where you're like already effectively mulled to 5? But it like looks like a playable magic hand. Like just kind of going back and mulliganing to your matchup, not mulliganing to a hand that looks good, basically.
Yeah, and I think it's about knowing what type of deck you have. Like a lot of the players that we know that play like a competitive constructed tournaments as well, they'll often say like, know your deck as well. Does your deck have nut draws? If you're playing Tron and Modern, you want to be mulliganing for the nut draw hands. You don't want to be playing a dirtle slow 7. You want to like have an explosive 5 or 6, right? And having multiple looks at a consistent deck is good. I tend to play and enjoy playing decks that are fairly, I'd say, consistent, have access to tutors, usually 5 or 6 effects, the same thing. So I feel like I can often reliably mulligan to removal if I'm facing certain matchups where that's important, or like either a clock or interaction and a card advantage. Obviously from there, the game goes how the game goes. But I'll echo your sentiment also that many players will perceive a really bad matchup and then will keep an average hand against them and then wonder why it feels so bad. And it's like, well, for example, a lot of players that are losing to goblins, they will keep a hand that has no forked bolt, pyro, fury, etc., when they could definitely mulligan to that kind of interaction and potentially like blow the other player out, or like no acceleration. And obviously I'm thinking like fair interactive mid-range decks here, which goblins is pretty advantaged against to begin with. But then if they're also keeping these hands that are like, if they're playing on the fair game, it's like you're never going to beat them or tokens or these go wide decks if you don't either have a combo plan, have a fast mana plan, or have a removal / sweeper plan.
So we see Sacha moving on to face eventual champion Thomas in the semifinals. Sacha, I'd love to know your thoughts on just kind of the matchup in general, because I think I have a very differing thought on these matchups. And I'm wondering, I think we've talked about it offline a little bit, but like, how do you find this like 3 to 4 color good stuff blue matchup with Breach
In a
Day?
word, I love it. Like, spoiler alert, did not win against Thomas. But we've played, I believe, like 3 times of him being on Jeskai Green, and I think one of the matchups Jeskai. I think he's won 1 game between all of those matches before this top 8. The matchup feels really good, and the ability to have access to this like suite of like having access to these 2 combos matters a lot here, because it constantly keeps him guessing, and you have a better density of these transmute cards that you can just like they allow you to develop your combo and like set up it really well into opposing counter magic. The other thing that really strikes me about it in general is like the Jeskai decks that exist, that certainly are seeing play on the Discord that I see pop up in different metas. They tend to favor playing a lot less creatures, and the creatures they do play are not the most aggressively inclined ones. So they really do act like control decks. And if you're any player that has played control in historically, you know that you're a lot less favored against combo than I'd say like newer players may expect. Counterspells do not equate a good matchup. I will flag. Thomas chose to include an interesting card, which ended up being a very pivotal card in our match, and that was a single copy of Counterbalance without Sensei's Dividing Top. Let me tell you, that card, if it's in play, can definitely flip the script on the match.
Yeah, I mean, and I think he even brought that up in his interview, playing Counterbalance as like his favorite card to play. So it's interesting that it did end up swinging the match so much. Because yeah, I think like our kind of when you had first started playing the deck and kept running into blue red kind of control, blue red delver kind of thing, and like your initial thought was, oh, this matchup's terrible, and then we both kind of realized like, well, unless they have like literal exactly turn 1 Ragavan, the pressure just isn't enough
Yeah,
that
like
most of their stuff matters.
no, for this match, like as Spencer was talking about having access to that density and like aggressively mulliganing. If you're playing these kinds of Jeskai green and like blue based mid range decks, and you are more of a control deck, I think it is really important in the combo matchup to like keep a hand that's either going to cast Ancestral Recall and you don't care, or put a creature into play aggressively and use that. And Ragavan happens to be the best one at doing that because it lets you continue to build up your mana and develop your board a lot more than any other card that would be comparable. So just running through this game 1 a little bit, I've said when I won this game, listen, if I lose this match, it was all worth it. And I still say that now. This single game was great. Such a high, big fan. I highly recommend the replay for it.
Yeah, I think there was a comment in the Discord, I want to say, and it was just something to the effect of, this is why we play this format, as Sacha's casting, not transmuting Dimir mechanicians to get through a possible counterbalance.
Yeah.
I know the Discord enjoyed that very much.
And so that was game 1. Game 2, I don't have a slide for this. Basically, Thomas resolved a counterbalance and won. That's basically the gist of what happened. So I was able to fight through it game 1, but game 2, it really was difficult to deal with. I think I misprosecuted some of the lines there. Definitely I'm playing a game of Magic, but I'm not necessarily playing to my outs maximally. But that was more of a in retrospect, I should have been thinking about a game plan. Game 3, I just want to highlight the absolute soul read that I had on Thomas here, which let me turn this game from a very losing proposition into a pretty winning one. He plays turn 1 Serum Visions on the draw and draws the top card. You see like a little bit of the eyes like enlarge slightly, and then he goes to the Scry 2, bottoms them both, and says, yeah, all garbage. And the second he did that, I knew the thing that he drew off the Serum Visions was either an Ancestral Recall or a Counterbalance. And so the way I had set up my turn was, oh, I'm gonna like untap, cast Wail of the Forgotten, so I can be maximally efficient with my mana. I have a Thought Season and Opt in my hand, and those are both cards that are actually better suited for the combo turn. But I just Soul Red Thomas and cast the Thoughtseize early, and yeah, paid dividends tagging this Ancestral Recall. Um, this game also was the one where I kind of lost the tournament. So going to this slide, I made two big misplays on this turn once we've kind of played Drago for a little bit. I draw Dark Ritual, and I have a Beseech the Queen in my hand. And a Brain Freeze, and an Infernal Tutor, and Force of Will Jace. I miscount my ability to Dark Ritual Beseech, and then escape Beseech again after casting the Underworld Breach. So that was my first mistake, and I ended up casting the Beseech with Dark Ritual. And that's just a miscount error. I was thinking about net mana versus actual mana, so big oops. Once I had actually done that, I inadvertently make a second misplay, because after I Dark Ritual Beseech, Thomas fires off a Reprieve. The second he does that, if I just Force of Will with the Jace there, I win the game on the spot, because it lets me Beseech for Infernal Tutor, which then makes, or Beseech for Lion's Eye Diamond, which then makes my Infernal Tutor alive. So big misplay on my end, twofold, take complete responsibility. But I think it's kind of illustrates one of the things that makes this piloting this deck so difficult, is you kind of have to make decisions about your overall game plan from your opener. And like from my opener that I had here, I was definitely thinking like, in the context of having Infernal Tutor in my hand and this Force of Will plus Jace, I'm leaning more towards Breach, but I'm in this awkward spot where like I don't want to pitch Jace to Force of Will, because if I try to use this Beseech to develop a Underworld Breach and put that into play, I'm going to, and say that gets dealt with, this Infernal Tutor that may be the last card in my hand to be turned online, I can't use, because if I get Doomsday, I can't win with Jace. So this was big misplays on my end. Yeah, tough stuff.
Yeah, that was definitely felt like a big turning point. Did you have any other discussion you wanted just from the kind of conclusions of this match?
Yeah, this game 4, I think this illustrates why what we were talking about this matchup being good. This is a game where Thomas played turn 1 Ragavan, had a Wasteland, pendinged something on my side of the board, had a Tidebinder, had a Mana Leak, and a No More Lies. I won this game. Like, if that doesn't tell you how effective the Doomsday Breach deck is at fighting through these things, I don't know what will. Now we've entered what I will affectionately call the Salt Zone, if in case it wasn't clear. Game 5. I keep a hand that's Personal Tutor that can put a Doomsday on the stack on turn 2 after I Personal Tutored the Doomsday. Thomas plays a Ragavan. The game ends once he has resolved this Ragavan. Straight up. I did not have a way to deal with it. I had to play Drago for the rest of the game. He got me. He got me good. It was rough.
So you should have packed and negationed it, I think, is what you should have done.
Yes, of course, of course. Yeah, a good example of how setting up a hand that can be good for a matchup in general still has the chance of getting hit by variance. And here I am in the salt mine, a victim of variance, wishing for my Orum's chance, my silences, or my abeyances, where Thomas just keeps cruising with his recalls and Ragavans and stifles and counterbalances. Just
Was he playing Stifle?
Yeah, he got me really bad with it game 2.
Oh,
yeah,
I missed that.
Yeah, but in general, I just want to be very clear. I think this matchup is really good, and Thomas and me were chatting after the match, and both of us acknowledged like this particular match that we played at Best of 5 was not representative of like the matches that we played in the past, and both of us felt like there were some things that were uncommon to happen in general.
One thing I think that's a good takeaway from that match too, and I think you talked a little bit about Sacha, is just the importance of, if something happens like that gets you tilted or you make a mistake, especially when you're playing like a complex combo deck. And I know for myself as well, whenever I've done this, it's really important to take a second and not continue to play, because sometimes it's not the first misplay or mistake that kills you, it's the follow-up. Often when we're tilted or make mistakes or you miscount a mana for a combo or something like that, it's like you make a second mistake just as fast, and that one's usually the one that seals you. So I think it's always important to, like, when you recognize it, it's like, oh, you made an error, but it's like, okay, well, just take a second, maybe it's salvageable. And I think a lot of players are just really quick to, like, they don't want to look like they made a mistake, or they're like, oh wow, that was really bad, and then they almost double down on it instantly. And you see this in like tons of board states with combat, with like they play something out of sequence, and then they're like, oh well, I meant to do that, and here's my attack, you know.
Hmm.
I'm not saying that's what you did here, but
No,
just
no,
like it's
there's
good, it's a good lesson to just be like, take a second and breathe.
100%. And like, if you have committed to a misplay, there is kind of a sunk cost fallacy. Even if you have to concede like whatever the misplay was, it's better for you to make a more analytical decision past that point. And I think you're very, very smart in saying just like take a second, chill out, and reassess where you're at. And obviously, it's difficult to do that in the moment, but hey, that's what makes you a good Magic player.
From here, unfortunately, we have no more counselors active in our, but we do move to a rather spicy finals of Jeskai Green versus 5-color Thoracle Land. And yeah, I honestly, will be perfectly honest, have not watched this match to full. I did watch a bit of it, but didn't
I,
have the time commitment to to put into what was needed here.
I'll let Spencer take this one. I've talked a lot, and I watched this on times two speed, and that was still not fast enough.
I mean, like, this tournament was full of a lot of upsets. I mean, I watched this with last year's winner, D&T Jack, and our expectations were Gruul would beat Lands, Doomsday would beat Jeskai Green Control. We did think that Mardu would beat Blue Moon, and that happened. But then, yeah, there's just a bunch of upsets left and right. And as I was like, when it ended up being the finals, I'm like, these are not the two decks I expected to see in the finals necessarily. Just based on like their pairings. They both kind of, like, I feel, upset a 55 or a 60-40 match. So good on them for doing that. This was a very long match. I think there's some very interesting kind of plays that go on here. My big takeaway from this, Lands has a tendency to play safe against the blue decks when they need to be playing more aggressive. And I think that was my biggest takeaway from watching this as well, is that I would have leaned into the strip waste mana denial strategy and the dark depth strategy of Jacob's deck more. And he did lean really heavily into the dark depth side, as opposed to maybe necessarily going for Thoracle. And Thomas did a good job of kind of exploiting, sometimes I felt like, the time that Jacobs spent to set up. That was my takeaway anyway. Not every game that applied to, but they were very long games.
Yeah, the other thing that kind of surprised me, and this didn't really end up coming up in the matches, but against Jeskai Green, I definitely felt playing the more artifact-centric decks. Urza Saga is so difficult for them to slog through, and I feel like Jacob having access to that card, he may have just wanted to get it in some of these situations. Obviously, the 1-mana artifact that he can tutor is not as valuable in those decks. Sometimes you can just alter your game plan on the fly, and for Jacob's deck, you can say to what he gets to present to Thomas is like, okay, you're expecting me to interact on this like enchantment angle where I'm going to play this like kind of these multitudinal value engines, and you're going to try and deal with that while keeping me from comboing with my very expensive combo cards. Saga kind of lets him juke that plan and say, hey, you're going to have to answer some threats at some point, and they're going to be low to the ground, and you probably mulliganed hands that did not have reasonable, or that may have had good answers to them.
100%. And also, instead of trying to tutor out Dark Depths, which is answerable by a lot of cards within Jeskai, weirdly enough, you can just tutor up There's a Saga, recur it. There's so much land recursion in that deck. If you recur and There's a Saga once, like, it's pretty difficult for Jeskai to deal with those
Yeah, one card that I definitely feel like Jacob may have benefited from, and I think this is just something that Lands players should think about as well, is getting access to Retrofitter Foundry. And when you were talking earlier about people need to actually attack against these recall decks and these kinds of slow or control decks that want to play at a meandering pace, if you're playing cards like Wargate and Sylvan Scrying and Crop Rotation, putting Retrofitter Foundry in your deck as a way, or as a fetch for Saga, is honestly one of the like highest percentage cards you can include in your deck, because you're going to get it a high percentage of the time. But then also it's just so difficult for those decks to consistently answer the threats that are produced by it, unless they happen to have one of those, again, rare draws where they present reasonable threats.
Oh yeah, no, I agree 100%. Retrofitter Foundry is like a very powerful card.
Yeah, I know I'd end up not including it in the Saga list I've played mainly because I've been playing more like aggressive saga lists and not really artifact based ones. But that's a card I've got to kind of consider a little bit more. I think it is. I think you're exactly right. It's extremely powerful and such a low cost opportunity to be including it in your deck. Any other thoughts on the finals, gentlemen? We've got our I love tabletop RPGs recalls per game. Is this just the finals?
This is just the finals. Thomas played 2 recalls, game 1 and 2, 1 in game 3, and played 3 in game 4. He had an average of 2 recall, or yeah, he had an average of 2 recalls in the finals. So I like memeing on Thomas. One of my favorite pastimes. But legitimately, congratulations to him for winning the top 8. And God bless his ability to draw that little ancestral recall.
Yeah, I mean it's historically a very important way to win at Highlander. I I don't know, it's got to be up there in terms of like pointed card wins over the course of time and will continue to do so. I think Jeskai Green's probably like the deck of the year, kind of as it were, and Thomas played it very successfully and definitely big props to him.
Yeah, and the one takeaway that I really have for his exact card choices, with the exception of the counterbalance, was just kind of how well the Jeskai deck has ossified online, and you see that borne out in some local metas too that we can talk about later. They really have come to a configuration that they all seem quite happy with. I say they, but it seems to be the collective conscience. Obviously, like, this is a deck that only plays good cards. The worst card in the deck probably is Cryptic Command, and that should tell you where it's at. Like, it has a bunch of good things. I do think that there is potentially a danger in just kind of assuming that the list that is played the most is the best. Like, we were talking earlier about how the lack of threats really does hinder its ability to prosecute certain matchups. And I think for the Jeskai Green deck, it would definitely benefit if it had like potentially a more robust suite of aggressive creatures it could play or would be willing to play.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see if kind of in the new year we start seeing a shift away from Jeskai Green into Jeskai Black, just with access to Bowmasters and also the new, like, I think that new Psychotog as like a low to the ground threat is really going to help.
That sounds like upcoming content.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, kind of shifting. The great segue is basically what I'm saying. We've just had our, it's the tournament with the most eyes on it. I don't know biggest indicator really of like what's good and what's not. It is a very inbred tournament where people are kind of guessing and trying to figure out what other people are going to play, and oh, he's going to be on this, I need to tech for this kind of thing. It is kind of the wrap up of, it should be the wrap up of the year. Obviously, we're in March now. It's kind of a good time to take a look and reflect on the last 12 months of Magic cards that have been printed and where we think the format and the metagame is at right now. Spencer, we'll go to you first. I think your voice is the least used thus far.
Sometimes previously council chat, we often chat about for the current state of the meta, what are our top 3 decks at the moment. So I think for the state of the meta right now, I'd say that I think that Jeskai Green still has the mantle of the best deck or one of the best decks of the format. I don't think the build is solidified, whether you want to be base of more of a Jeskai control or more of an Omnath kind of initiative deck with a little more threats. And I think like once a blue deck emerges to the top, there's always an inbred blue mid-range meta that evolves around that. But yeah, I'd still say Jeskai Green top deck. I think that Gruul Monsters is still a very strong deck. I think that it's kind of defeated D&T and Medium Red as what I consider to be like one of the better fair decks of the format. Both those other decks are still very good. And then I still think that Time Vault is a very powerful deck and just doesn't see a ton of representation sometimes. But either that or Doomsday would be my combo decks of choice to round out my kind of 3 most powerful decks. And I know that I listed like 7 there, but hey, that's the way it goes sometimes. When the best deck is a 4-color good stuff pile, you do see aggressive strategies and combo strategies start to rise up. And I think there's a bit of a race to like fundamental turn lowering. And I think that we saw that happen over the course of this last like year and a half, 2 years. And then there's one of the interesting responses to that, at least I see it a lot locally, is that you have kind of goblins, you have Mardu tokens, you have these synergy attacking the side axis sort of decks that are punishing people that are trying to like really interact super early. They're punishing players that are trying to do 1-for-1 removal or 1-for-1 cards. Those decks really struggle against those sorts of decks. So I think looking forward, we might see some kind of answers to that, and maybe we might see the response to that being a surge of combo decks, which is what I'd expect in every meta the next little while. Combo, I think, is in a good place right now. It usually isn't a good place in our format. It just takes people actually like picking up and putting in reps. There's some discussion on pointing changes. I think most of us have said that we would like to see the where we sit after Modern Horizons, because that one always
Yeah.
seems to spice things up quite a bit. We've already seen some cool cards from it that slot into existing archetypes. So maybe that, there's always some archetypes where like 4 or 5 cards injected into that archetype, like bring it up like a solid half tier sometimes. So it adds the consistency of the deck, maybe a little more CMC threats, CMC removals. Usually these are just good stuff piles. So hey, that's the way it goes. But lots of discussion around Minsk and Boo right now. Jeskai Green, absolute, maybe having to choose between that and fourth might make there be a different version of a blue mid-range pile that comes out on top, like you're suggesting with Jeskai Green. Like if Jeskai loses Minsk and Boo, I think then it's like, okay, well, is Oko and Uro, and not really even Goif, but it's like Oko and Uro really worth it at that point? Like, is Minsk and Boo that much better than fourth? And I think Miskling for fourth is much better if you're more of a control version. And then it's like, well, black definitely adds some like elements to hedge up your combo game with Op Agent and Hand Attack and Boat Masters and potentially with some other threats. I think we could see some interesting kind of like inbreeding around the top of that meta. Not really too much innovation on the fair creature front. I think still like Gruul, D&T, Naya, medium red, taking the helm on that. Always other mid-range brews going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just saying, like, I think locally the breakout deck of the year was definitely Mardu. It had a nice kind of run, that it has continued on into 2024 as well, and it's already picked up a few wins early into the year here. Like, I remember when I came back in like early 2023, like a couple months in, and like Spencer, you were making fun of me for playing sweepers based on kind of where the metagame was at that point in time. Like, it was weird to be playing sweepers in my blue red deck. And now we've kind of almost come full circle where, I don't know, I think like sweepers at a local level, and even not at a local level, like if you're playing a bunch of card draw or tutors or any way to kind of reliably get access to that kind of effect, like I think including sweepers in almost any non-creature deck is again like kind of necessary almost at this point in time. And you saw that with all red decks, including Pyrokinesis by the middle point of the year, in addition to Fury, and then again some of the control decks starting to pack like 3 CMC sweepers again, or even like the bigger Jeskai deck that had a lot of success locally. Shout out Chris Sutherland with 4 or 5 Wrath of God effects in it, and claiming a lot of victims from people perhaps not used to someone consistently having that effect on turn 4.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because you see this, like, the Discord meta certainly has done I think, a pretty good job in respecting that aggro threat and not falling victim to the danger of a resurgent aggro archetype on the whole. Just because they're more willing to include like a diversity of those 3 mana, 3 damage sweepers. And I think I talked about this in the preparation episode for the top 8, but like those cards are very, very good right now. Obviously, it's meta dependent, and if you're taking this as advice, like you should be looking at those cards always as a potential option. And even if the deck that you normally would play can't really benefit from them, maybe that means that you should be looking at the decks that can support it, and maybe it's just a good time to be playing like Anchor of the Gods deck and like Escape Shift pile, for instance.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly. I think that's kind of all be unretiring a couple weeks, and that's kind of the first place that I'll be looking to start with is making sure I'm respecting goblins, respecting token decks, and being able to kind of completely clean up, and not oh well, I got a 2-for-1 and I'm still super behind on board. Like, that's not a great place to be.
I do just want to quickly go back to something that Spencer said that I think is very, very smart, and it's just about the placement of green red monsters in the meta. On the axis of death and taxes on one end and medium red on the other, I feel like green red monsters occupies the best of both worlds, and I think really is, or really has cemented itself as the premier like aggro deck of our format. And I think that the power that it brings is very robust, and it's one of the few decks that I think can have a good matchup against both the kind of degenerate combo decks that exist, but also against like more of the initiative styled Jeskai builds. And I think it can struggle sometimes against more the Jeskai green deck as it's built by, say, Thomas and by many of the members of the Discord. But that deck definitely, I think, has some very strong staying power, and you see that borne out in the results in general, even if we didn't see it in this particular event.
Yeah, and I think that it speaks to that where the aggro decks fit in the metagame also speaks to like what is coming next. You know, D&T winning the Discord year in top 8 because they had a bit of a more of a combo and like mid-range interactive meta right going at the time. But if you look at, okay, well, Gruul is kind of taking the premier spot and it's about speed, then combo decks that are going to go really fast are like, well, hey, if people are shelving D&T because D&T can't handle all these go wide decks, monster decks, and pyrokinesis decks, then it's probably a good time put up a Lotus, a Breach, or a Time Vault, you know?
Yeah, I look forward to seeing where we get to. I think my worry level in terms of like Modern Horizons 3 is low for our format in terms of it will obviously be the most impactful set that we get all year. There's zero chance that that's not true, I don't think. However, I don't really have as much concerns as I would for like Modern or something because we self-regulate with a lot of the stuff with the council and everything else versus having to wait for Wizards to make a decision. My only kind of thought with the format as a whole right now is I'm just not 100% convinced that like Turbo Initiative isn't still the best or one of the best things to do, and it's not my favorite thing just because of it kind of blanks a lot of what some decks are trying to do or just kind of limits your ability as a control deck. I don't know. That's the one thing that I'm kind of have my eye out for is if there's I don't think it's really possible for them to print more initiative cards, like that's not going to happen for sure, and then also like cards that turbo into initiative cards are not really cards that they print anymore either. So I think we'll probably be fine in that regard, but it's just something keeping my eye on to see if there's another kind of explosion of any cards like that.
Yeah, I do just want to say, like, I know that there is this underlying concern for a lot of players whenever one of these new sets comes in and injects a lot of new cards to the format. And this is true not just for Highlander, but just I mean, across the spectrum. I definitely have found with the Modern Horizons line, if you will, of sets, they tend to temper the eternal formats in a much more balanced way, at least in our context, and to a lesser extent in Legacy. Like, there's going to be some outlier cards that are obviously just slam dunks, and everybody includes them from here on out. Cards like Fury, cards like Ragavan. Brennan 6 is a good example. But when you talk about the kind of more format warping cards, they really are pretty much exclusively commander things. Things like the Monarchy, things like the Initiative. Minsk and Boo is the prime example of this too. So I do think that if you, the listener, if you are concerned about where this ship is going, that is Canadian Highlander in the rough seas of MH3, fear not, we'll almost certainly be fine. Sacha said, knock on wood. I do think the state of our format is in a good spot. I think there are some small things that we could do from the points perspective, but I think it's mostly just kind of maintenance. And we've reached the point of our when I came to the council, there were definitely a lot of things that I wanted to see done, a lot of changes that I thought were desperately needed. We've kind of gone through a lot of those, and I feel very good about where we've ended up at this particular spot, particularly around crop rotation and strip mine.
Taylor, I always think that the problem with the initiative cards is obviously like it's one of the more powerful fair things you can be doing in the format in terms of like a fair creature mirrors, but it's also one of the only tools that a lot of the fair creature decks have to like combine with fast mana to actually A, close out games, and B, like actually service threats to control and combo decks. So I think sometimes the builders in us, like the deck builders and the brewers that are trying to build cool port decks or synergy decks, we can get annoyed when we like lose to an initiative deck because we're trying to do a cool mid-range pile that has some sort of synergy built around like food or treasure tokens or prowess or something like that. And we're just like, oh, WPA, cool. Gets me yet again. But like without the access to like powering out, like, and this is why I always think that Mox and how they relate to the rest of the power and the list is pretty intrinsic and important to how fair versus unfair decks fight each other. Without powering out threats that can close out a game really fast, the fair quote unquote decks of the format will just never be able to compete with the blue mid-range piles and combo. So that's why I'm always, I'd say, slightly defensive of pointing fast mana, although I think that it's often the actual cause of a lot of people's problems with those cards. But I'm definitely like not interested in pointing cards like WPA, and I'm resistant to pointing Mix Kambu, although I'm more in line with that one than some others, as far as those sorts of cards go, just because I see them as like the tools of the fair decks to fight unfair in an unfair world.
Yeah, and I actually I honestly agree with you. I have at one point. I'm still on the like I wouldn't point either of them, but I would rather point Seasoned Dungeoneer than WPA. But I think I wouldn't point either of them, and I think for basically the reasons that you've said, that it is the tool to kind of keep combo to like a serviceable matchup for decks that are attempting to be aggressive. And without access to that, it would be a lot harder like to keep the win rates at a reasonable level for sure. So I appreciate that. I'm just salty at how many finals I lost to turn 1 or 2 Seasoned Dungeoneers and WPAs this year.
Just one final note on initiative too. If you'll notice, a lot of decks are actually eschewing a lot of the 4-drop initiative cards lately as a symptom of like what I believe to be like initiative is really good when the format's either like really about the fast mana and then these fair mid-range piles. But if people are perceiving that it's like, okay, well, it's actually more about like being really quick, or it's about comboing, or it's about like really low turn interaction, I didn't play a lot of the 4 mana initiative cards in my decks either because I think they're too slow. And it also introduces a mechanic that's dangerous to a mid-range deck or a fair deck. If you can't actually like win on that axis a lot, like if you don't have a lot of haste, if you're not going wide, if you don't have tokens, it introduces a mechanic that can like lose you the game. Most D&T players will talk about how, WPA is not always a good play. And I think that's also interesting. So maybe when the format slows down again, it'll seem like the most powerful thing you can be doing. But I think right now it's actually not the most powerful thing fair decks can be doing.
And I would agree with that 100%. Like I think locally with the way the meta's against goblins and Mardu, it's like you cannot cast your Dungeoneer or something and not be like, well, there's like a 50% chance that this loses me the game. Like it's a very risky proposition because it is so much harder to keep the initiative than it was a year ago for sure. So I would agree with that point.
Love all these points. I also like the thing that I love so much about the dynamic that the initiative has introduced is the ability for aggro decks to go under mid-range. And I think that that was something that was sorely lacking in our format for a long time. Like with all of these just haymaker 4-drops, it's really difficult to play an aggro deck out there in that context. And I think the initiative is one of those few things where it's this amazing mechanic to be slated against these like slower control decks, and it allows certain decks that accelerate it out to actually raise combo. But it also gives aggro decks a means to like deny their opponent a big resource. Like when you're under pressure, you do not want to be applying that initiative to play because you know you're going to get trapped really quickly, where your opponent's going to just get to the forge. And more to the point, you're going to have fight by attacking to regain the initiative. So those are things that you're not blocking with. It's actually one of the reasons why I think that like these kinds of lower to the ground mono red sly prowess decks have a lot of legs because they're so good at punishing these initiative piles that I think in general very good against the rest of the meta, but you run the danger of losing to these aggro decks. And I think Gruul very smartly, because it has such a high density of both trample threats and haste threats, it's one of the best decks to not just accelerate out the initiative, although it has relatively few ways to do that, but to fight over it really effectively.
All right, well, thanks, gentlemen. That was a nice State of the Union address, as it were. And so now we're just going to really quickly here take a shout out to the wider meta game highlight, and yeah, we'll pass it over. Who's talking about the Discord year end here? We already touched on it a little bit.
I actually watched this player played some very tight games. I think they had an interesting build of D&T. I know that for those of you who don't like to play little 2-power 1 creatures, probably some of the subtleties are maybe not as interesting. Maybe you're not up to date on a lot of the arguments about the archetype lately, like whether Phyrexian Revoker and Samwise and Imposing Sovereign are good or great or not playable. Seems to come in and out. This build featured kind of 2 unconventional cards, Triumph of St. Catherine, Timeless Dragon. Suspect they're probably trying to hedge for a little bit of monsters and also Jessica Green with those cards. It'd be interesting to hear them talk about it. Treves TR33VS was the big winner. Had to go through a pretty wide gauntlet to get there, so props to them. This is a pretty sweet list. They also played a card that I think is going up in its stock to me in lots of decks is Unlicensed Hearse. They played a couple spicy ones with Soul Partition, as well as going with a Ghost Quarter over a Field of Ruin for their anti-lands package in the deck. Kind of shows you how like tight like these lists are, that maybe like changing 3 to 5 cards can be like quite interesting to people that like to explore this archetype, but proving once again that going into a big tournament, D&T is always a very good choice. So you're gonna play against it, has gaming against everyone, it can win any match. Except Mardu. That one seems pretty tough for it, but yeah, that's another discussion for the time.
Great. Well, yeah, congrats to them. And Sacha, go ahead. We've got the new market year end. Jeskai Green, another trophy for Jeskai. What do you like, or how does this list compare?
So I was looking through this deck, and first of all, props to player Sia for piloting it to a win in Newmarket for their year-end tournament. I was going through, and I think the only difference between his deck and Thomas's is he has a Triumph of St. Catherine and has not made the misplay of registering Counterbalance. So congratulations, Sia, for playing a strictly optimal version of this deck. Again, like we were talking about before, it definitely falls into the category of this control deck that is disinclined to play robust creature suite, but he still has some things in there, and playing things like Brotherhoods and robust removal spells. Deck's good.
I mean, it's continually good, and I think the council's done a good job at keeping an eye on it and gotten points tacked onto it, and it's still churning along. So, and finally, we've got the Legends domain pile, 3rd, 4th on the MTGO League, I believe. And yeah, this is an interesting list. I always look at these decks and I have a lot of love for them for sure. I do like creature piles, and there's some pretty spicy ones in this list. The one card that really stuck out to me is Saskia, because I've been trying to play a deck that can support it. I do really like that card, but it's obviously very hard to cast. Yeah, it's interesting because this list kind of has the suite of 1-drops going, like playing Zergo is interesting, and Yoshimaru, in addition to kind of the ones that you would expect to see. Yeah, just kind of going all the way up the chain with even like Luris, interesting ways to kind of keep themselves in the game. And I think that's one thing to look out for is aggro is really getting more tools to keep themselves getting card advantage, like more and more and more as time goes on. And I think that will probably continue as they print more and more cards. Like, they want the aggressive decks to be able to also draw cards, because everyone needs to draw cards now. So cards like Inti, developing aggressive boards, but also letting you sculpt your hand and find your hate bears and find cards for specific matchups at the same time. So cool list, and definitely pushing the boundaries of what an aggressive list can do, but maybe not pushing it as far as Sacha and I plan to in the near future.
I think this deck is pushing it far. I think it's pushed it off the edge.
Yeah, I mean, that's also possible for sure. And I think that's going to wrap it. Oh, sorry, I almost forgot. Sacha has a 4th spicy deck that only Sacha can talk about. So.
Oh yes, this is a deck that Rick from Newmarket registered for their year end. I just want to take a moment to highlight. This is, I believe, the Turbo Ring deck that has been popping up on the Discord. And for reference, if you're thinking, okay, kind of a conventional Paradox Academy deck, imagine that, but it's just putting the One Ring into play, and it's going to play lots of copy artifacts, so that way it can kind of replicate the renewed One Ring phenomenon that happens in Modern, where people play a One Ring to replace their One Ring. I think this deck, honestly, and the archetype in general, is a good example of how you can refine an existing deck away from some of the more anemic aspects of conventional deck building by eschewing things like wheels, but instead you're playing this really interesting tutor package centered around things like Beseech the Mirror to put One Ring into play and to combo with it in pretty quick order alongside cards like Paradox Engine and the Suite of Talismans. So very cool deck. Wanted to highlight it.
One thing on this deck that is interesting in terms of that I wanted your thought on, because I've built not quite as all in a combo version of this, but I did have a very similar deck in the queue, as it were. But I also used Mind Over Matter as a way to go infinite, basically. Obviously, it's like an incredibly expensive effect, but in an Academy deck, I was more centered on Time Vault than Tinker, though, so that also probably was a factor in my deck building. But is that card, do you think, just stone unplayable, or does it maybe have a purpose in lists like this?
I think if there was to be a home, it'd be in a deck like this, and I think it does not have a home in a deck like this.
Fair enough.
I think this is your maximum use case.
All right, fair enough.
What spicy decks are you guys working on right now? What's this spice?
So I've been goading Sacha a little bit. I've been working on like a no blue prowess, like basically zoo prowess deck that then ended up some sort of severe right hand turn onto the turnpike to include the domain package. So it's just like a Naya zoo prowess deck that also plays Leyline Binding, Neshoba Brawler, Territorial Kavu, and Scion of Draco. Just off of
Tribal Flames.
And Tribal Flames, Might of Alara, Gaia's Might, just with various double strikers and prowess creatures. Gaia's Might and Might of Alara allow you to like combo in quotes, kill people very quickly. And yeah, so that's the deck I've kind of got ready to roll for Monday, hopefully, or if not, not this Monday, but the Monday after. I will make a 2-week triumphant return before I come back for good in the spring.
That's awesome. I'm sorry that some deck I'm working on will not interact well with that deck.
It's
And
okay.
what is that?
Oh, I'm playing an Abzan combo deck. I'm devoted the next few months to playing green X combo of some sort.
Oh, I thought it was the year 2024 was the year of Martyr of Sands.
So I'm playing a best of 10 hard bet, multiple bets on the line against Thomas, playing Seeker Walk, where I said that I was willing to put hundreds of dollars on the line to say that Martyr will beat Seeker Walk, his version of Seeker Walk that I consider to be extremely poor.
I think any future discussion should happen in a non-documented setting, because I too want to get out of this.
The best part about this is we've already agreed that basically if it's a draw, we're playing 10 matches no matter what, and if it goes 5-5, everyone's a loser. And considering I've already made one player quit playing against Water of Sands and finish and scoop just due to unfun and negative player experience, I can only imagine what this will be like.
And on that note,
competitive. It's a competitive podcast, right?
Competitive podcast.
It's competitive
Water of Sands. All right. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. We do appreciate it.
All right. I think we're at the wrap stage.
Yeah. Fair
All
enough.
right. Thanks for listening, everyone, and enjoy your weekend. And talk to you in the next couple weeks.